Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and our week called Shot Down, the experiences of Allied POWs. Often they were air crews. Well, my guest, Steve Darlow, sometimes I have to give big, long introductions because they do a bit of everything. And Steve is one of those people: author, publisher, documentary maker, filmmaker, TV, YouTuber like me. There's not a single thing he doesn't do that is involved in sharing of knowledge about World War II. Prolific author that links to his books, his website, all in the description below. As always, that's where you can find information. I'll bring Steve in now to talk about one of his books, and that is The Last Kriegies. So the last surviving bomber personnel who found themselves part of the POW system in Germany and elsewhere. So I'll bring Steve in now. So good evening, Steve. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me on.
So, as I said, the last 2 years, what haven't you been involved in? So give us a potted highlights of some of the things you've been involved in over the last couple of years, because it's, you know, there've been some very busy, some very cool projects.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of times we've been taken up with theatre stuff. We're doing a musical about the ATA girls, and we've just done a verbatim piece called Their Finest Hour in London. So that's shown. And then working on Lancaster, which came out about this time last year, the feature documentary, which was a wonderful experience. And I would say it was the pinnacle of all the research I've done over the years. So to be able to co-produce and consult on that was fantastic. And now we're working on Mosquito. So we've got about 10 or 11 the veteran interviews in the can. We were doing some filming at the de Havilland Museum on Saturday with a pilot and a navigator. So we get those, because the 99 and 100 they were. We need to get those veteran interviews in the can, and then we'll start exploring air to air, and probably having to go overseas, obviously, for Mosquito air to air stuff. Yeah. And
just a question for someone who does very different projects, does your the way you go at these things as a historian, does it differ? Is the writing process different to the documentary process when you're interviewing people? Do you go into it with a different attitude, or do you just think, well, it's all just history, I'll be the same Steve Darlow I am at all of these projects?
Well, I think there's a difference, non-fiction and certainly theatre, and perhaps certainly in the documentary as well, because you've got to engage in documentary and theatre. You've got to engage and entertain. Yes, you can entertain with non-fiction, but you've got to entertain. And certainly in the theatre aspect, I'm very much, you can get bogged down in detail, and you can't do that. You've got people for an hour and a half, 2 hours. So I very much look at pulling out the emotional truth, which is subjective, but you're trying to pull out the emotional truth for the theatre. But we did 50 hours of interviews for Lancaster, and we got down to about an hour and 50 minutes. So you've just got to get your narrative storyline, which is 20 years of experience with Bomber Command. You've got that, and then just pulling out excerpts and filling in and fact checking everything over and over and over, because veterans' testimony can be we're relying on memory. So you go back to the ORBs, you go back to records, and you cross-reference everything. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that. And as we'll find out with looking at what we're talking about today, the last Kriegies, the POW experience, and obviously you'll talk about some of the operations these individuals on as well. The POW experience, literally hundreds of thousands of people were prisoners of various nations during World War II, and you could be from the same aircraft or the same regiment in the same prisoner of war camp for the same length of time, but the experience you have within that environment could be completely different, because everybody being different human beings and dealing with captivity, dealing with how you cope with the loneliness, the overcrowdedness, or whatever it would be. So when writing about prisoners of war, you have to be open to just so many different types of experiences. So let's talk about the book, and let's talk about who you're going to talk about. I'll hand over to you. And folks, we'll do questions as we go along. If you've got any questions, throw them in the sidebar and I'll post them to Steve. But basically, I'm going to hand over to Steve to tell us about some of these individuals.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Paul. So so the last of the Kriegies book. So we've got 5 Bomber Command airmen, and we'll just focus on 2 of them tonight. And what I'll do is I'll read extracts from the book that highlight certain experiences and certain details, and maybe we can expand on them as we go. The first person I'm talking about is David Fraser, who's actually in the Lancaster documentary. People might have seen him. So he was shot down on the night of 10th and 11th of May 1941, attacking the Blom and Voss works. He was an air gunner on 115 Squadron on Wellingtons, and so this is David's account of that fateful night. The night of 10th of May 1941 was clear with a full moon, and as we approached our target, the Blom and Voss works at Hamburg docks, the flak increased in density. On our run up to the target, as we were about to release our bombs, there was a violent burst that destroyed any chance of accurate bombing. We decided, therefore, to make another attempt, which was more successful. As we turned away from the target and made for home, we were trapped in the beam of a blue-coloured searchlight, and immediately 7 other lights locked onto us. We then realised we'd been coned, and Andy, our skipper, took violent evasive action, but to no avail. We were well and truly caught. Despite our desperate aerobatics and the flak increased with great accuracy, I could hear and feel the shrapnel striking the aircraft, and the reek of cordite indicated that the shell bursts were really on target. Then, suddenly, the flak ceased, and there was an ominous silence. We then realised there was a night fighter in the vicinity. The searchlights were still holding us, and Alex, our second pilot, was stationed in the Astrodome, called out, "Look out for that fighter on the port quarter, Dave." I couldn't see anything, as a flak burst had wrecked the hydraulic system to the turret, which was covered with hydraulic fluid, resulting in total opacity. When I attempted to swing the turret to engage the fighter, nothing happened, as my guns had been rendered useless by the lack of hydraulic pressure. My illuminated gun sight was non-existent. Then the fighter then fired a burst which raked the port side of the aircraft and my turret. The escaped hydraulic fluid in the bottom of the turret ignited, and the flames appeared near my right foot. I called to the skipper that my turret was on fire, and he sent Bill, our navigator, to assist me with a fire extinguisher. By the time Bill arrived, I put the fire out by vigorous stamping, so I waved him back. Another burst from the fighter ignited the remaining flares in the rack, and a raging inferno ensued. Andy gave the order to bail out. Normally, I'd have rotated the turret 90 degrees, jettisoned the doors, and dropped out backwards, but owing to the lack of oil pressure, the turret was immovable. Even the hand-turning gear was useless. The turret had jammed, so only half a door's width was available for my exit towards the front of the aircraft. I managed to squeeze out of the narrow gap and into the fuselage where my parachute was kept, and made my way to the rear side escape hatch. Just as I reached it, another burst from the fighter struck the aircraft. It sounded like heavy hail on a tin roof. Alex was lying near the hatch and had managed to remove the cover. He was badly wounded with blood oozing from his chest and arm. He was wearing his parachute, so I guided his hand to the D-ring, which is pulled to release the chute, and stuffed him through the hatch. I then leaned out and to my relief saw his chute immediately open. I looked across to the main hatch and saw Bill bending over it. The hatch was open. He was obviously contemplating his exit. I then waved him farewell and dropped out into the night. I did not know at the time that as Bill was returning to his position, after I'd waved him away, having dealt with the fire in my turret, he was hit in the back by a burst from the fighter, and in his weakened state, he dropped his parachute through the hatch. But unaware of this, I hastened to leave the aircraft, and after a very brief count of 5, I pulled the rec cord. For a couple of seconds, which seemed like an eternity, nothing happened. Then the chute opened with a body-checking jolt, and I was descending into the unknown. I was falling smoothly as there was no wind when I heard the sound of an aircraft engine, and a Messerschmitt 110 buzzed me and then immediately disappeared. I appeared to be falling towards a river, and in order to avoid a watery landing, I hauled on the shroud lines of my parachute to slip away from the river, which caused me to swing like a giant pendulum. The ground suddenly came rushing up at great speed, and just before I hit the deck, I swung forward and landed on the base of my spine. So that's David's account of that particular night, and he remember him saying he was so frustrated. All his training, he got to that point for combat with an enemy aircraft, and his turret jammed, and he was so angry that he couldn't do anything about it. But he's out of the burning aircraft, and all the friends he'd ever had. In fact, the pilot was killed, but everyone else managed to get out and become a prisoner of war. So I'll just jump forward a bit with David's account. I was assailed by a feeling of utter loneliness, having been precipitated into an alien country where, undoubtedly, every man's hand would be against me. It was Fraser versus the Third Reich. This was followed by a sense of shock and horror. One moment we'd been operating as an efficient crew in a perfectly serviceable aircraft, and then in a matter of minutes, the scene had been transformed into one of carnage and mayhem, with one of my comrades lying wounded in a blazing inferno. So that feeling of going from being part of a team, part of a squadron, and then I'm going to go into a story terminology here, Paul, if that's right. From in that story, you have the rebirth of the hero. it's sort of a rebirth. They've come from that, and now there's a completely new situation they're in, an environment that they're in that they've never experienced before, and they now have to deal with it.
And this is early in the war, isn't it, Steve? So this is really before the influence of MI9, everybody else who are starting to brief people on this is the best protocol. And, this is probably pre most of the escape gear that came later. So this is, correct me if I'm wrong, this is kind of on the job training. If you were shot down 44, 45, the dangers of being shot down are the same, but there's a little bit more information being assimilated by this point about how to deal with it. Doesn't mean the dangers have gone away. So at this point, I guess you've been trained to operate the position you've been given in an aircraft, but on the ground, it's kind of on the job training, really.
Well, it is. That's right. Later in the war, some people have got back and been able to tour the squadrons and be able to pass on information about how to deal with these situations. And I think David was 19 years old when he's thrown into this situation. Wow. He was captured, and I won't go necessarily into the capture, but we're going to contrast something later on. So just another excerpt. We're going to contrast what I'm going to read now with something that comes later on. So this is again back to David talking, and he's been caught and driven to an officer's mess, where he says, we were regaled with coffee and cognac. The officers were a pleasant lot, all with healthy suntans, obviously acquired in Spain and brimming with self-confidence. They assured us that our stay in Germany would be for only a short time, as Germany would win the war within 6 months and England would be occupied. Their Führer, Adolf Hitler, would celebrate his victory with a grand parade, and he would head the parade on a white horse and occupy Buckingham Palace. We laughed and simply said, wait and see, which hugely amused the assembled company, and there were many loud guffaws and scornful laughter. When the time of our departure arrived, the whole mess to a man turned out to see us off. And as we bade them farewell, they all chorused, wait and see. I often wonder how many of them survived the war. I know one of them achieved this because on the 50th anniversary of our downing, we met him in Germany. He was the pilot who shot us down, and we learned that we were his first victims. He finished the war with a tally of 36 other victories. So there's that wait and see. If anyone sees the Lancaster documentary, David wags his finger, wait and see. He says says like that. So there's a sense between the Luftwaffe and the RAF there. There's a sort of like a friendly, I don't want to use the word competitiveness, but they're quite pleasant to each other. And it's but we're going to come on to something, and we can contrast that later. In the photographs that we got there, that's David's prisoner of war identity photograph, and if you look into his eyes now, you can hear in his head that wait and see. You might have got me in body, but you haven't got me in mind.
There's definitely an attitude in that photo. I've seen a few Kriegie photos, and they're giving evil would be the teenage speak. There's a real sense of defiance, like as you say, you've got my body, but you haven't got my mind, and I will do everything I can to make your life difficult. Now you've got me. It's in his eyes.
Yeah, and David was certainly that kind of character. We lived down in Kent, and he'd go swimming in the sea, even up to, in his mid-90s. He was a defiant fit chap. So this is May 1941. I mean, David eventually then he goes off to Gulag Luft and ends up in a prisoner of war camp, and he actually he was there for 4 years. So he did try a number of escapes himself. Which we cover in the book, so I won't go into them here. You'll have to get.
We can't. As always, when anyone comes on, it's excerpts of a book, and I urge you to go on and get the full stories in there. But for the purposes of a week of shows, it's the highlights we want. So it's the accounts you read there. For someone like yourself, who's interviewed and spoken to innumerable numbers, he wrote really well, didn't he? I mean, there's no pulling out a story there and trying to make something of it. It's all there for you. I mean, you've just got to regurgitate and put it in print, and it's there. Job done.
Yeah, I mean, the nature of this book, the way, if I can just quickly, how the book came about.
Please.
So one of Albert Gunn, his daughter, she sent me his manuscript, and I said, look, there's not enough there for a book, but let me think. And then I knew David, and David had written his story. So I said, okay, well, let's put together let's get 5 accounts. So some of them had been written. So David's written his account. But some of the other guys, Charles Clark and Reg, were coming on to. They were interviews. I went and sat and interviewed them and then transcribed them. And my job in the book is to give them the space to talk, and I will add context as and where it's where it's necessary. I just would like to read now, because we touched on that loneliness, and I'm just a brief piece from Henry Wagner, who was he was a Halifax navigator, and he was shot down a lot later in the war. But he's written a really nice little paragraph called Reflection. In fact, we had the theatre show we just did called Their Finest Hour. We had someone read this out. Fantastic job in performing it. So Henry was Halifax. He was the only survivor from his crew of 7. Interestingly, whenever we did signing events, Henry would sign, and right underneath, only survivor from a crew of 7. So that clearly played on his mind all the time. Well, and I'll come back to that sort of feeling a bit later. So this is Reflection by Henry Wagner, which I've sort of got right at the start of the book. I do not think a man can ever be so lonely as when he is alone and hunted like an animal in a strange and hostile land, cold, wet and hungry, where he can be sure that every man's hand will be turned against him, some with murderous intent. There'll be no help forthcoming from any quarter. He has no companion to support him, to talk things over with, to plan ahead. There is no thing or person besides him. He has nothing but his own resources, and he must stand alone on his own 2 feet. Although the chances of a happy outcome are remote, if in fact they exist at all, while there is life, there is hope. It is raining and there is no shelter, but hang on in there. Yeah, I think that's a beautifully written piece by Henry.
And it says a lot. And the fact, he, as you said there, when he signed autographs, he put the surviving part there. There's got to be that survivor's guilt, preying on him. And we've talked about the bonds of crews in other shows, be it tank crews, air crews, whatever. But when, as you said yourself, when they're then separated, you go from being a very important part of a slickly oiled machine to being on your own. You're missing that guy to your right who does the other part of the job, and the guy in front of you who does the other part of the job, and suddenly you're on your own. And then I guess your youth then starts coming through, isn't it? When you're 19, 20, and you on your own in a country where, as Henry said that in that camp there, everybody's at least out to get you, maybe not kill you, but to capture you and put you into captivity. It's a hostile environment to be in.
And it certainly was when Henry was shot down late 44. It had become a lot more hostile, and we'll touch on that bit now when we talk about Reg's. And so the picture we've got up there, that's Henry's prisoner of war identity card. Again, a young man looking quite defiant there in the corner. Okay, so we'll move on to Reg Barker now.
Yep, please do.
So Reg, what a wonderful man, beautiful man in his nature. There he is. He's dearly loved by his family. This sounds a bit odd, but I went to Reg's funeral, and it's one of the most joyous funerals I've ever been to. It was such a celebration of his life. He was clearly adored by his family. Beautiful natured man. And they were and the family. He was still alive when we put the book together, because I'd interviewed him before, and we put it together. And the family were very, very helpful with that. So Reg was so he was shot down on the 26th, 27th of August 1944 on a raid to Kiel. He was a pilot with 635 Squadron on Lancasters, and this is Reg's account of that night. So they're coming out from Kiel, and they're hit by flak. As I was holding the control column, the nose started. Excuse me, I'll start again. As I was holding the control column, the nose started going down, and I realised I had no control over the tailplane at all. It meant that we had no choice but to abandon the aircraft, and I gave the order to the crew. The nose now was right down, and we found ourselves in a very tight spin, going vertically back towards the fires of Kiel. My last view of the altimeter, we had been flying at 17,000 feet, showed us to be at 13,000 feet, and we were going down at great speed. The moment we were hit, I'd opened up all 4 engines to the maximum speed, 4 beautiful Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. They were behaving perfectly, and now we were flying vertically downwards towards the ground. We were only seconds away from death. The G-force was so great that I was lifted out of my seat, and I was aware that there was no alternative but to hit the ground. I remember a momentary prayer, God, make it quick. I didn't really want to be fried up in the fires. This was split seconds we were talking about. There wasn't any time for my life to pass before me. The moment I'd given the order to abandon aircraft, the bomb aimer who was down in the nose opened the hatch and dropped out. With the hatch open, there was a terrific roaring of wind through the plane. We were descending at this tremendous speed, and it was absolutely deafening. I'd never ever heard such a loud shrieking noise. 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines screaming away, the aircraft vibrating, and the noise of the wind blowing through. I didn't know at that time that we had lost our tail, and that was why we were in this vertical spin. So, this was the end of Reg Barker. I felt so at peace. It was an incredible feeling of calmness after knowing certainly that I was going to die. This was the end of my life. There's no question about it, and it didn't panic me in any way at all. The end was here, and that was it. Suddenly, after this most deafening noise, there was total silence. I blacked out. I lost vision, lost hearing. Everything was silent, total silence. Reg Barker had arrived in that heavenly place to which he was obviously intended. But after a few moments of this amazing quietness, total bliss, this peace, suddenly there came this swishing sound, which I later realised was the wind tearing through my clothes as I was hurtling towards the ground. I was outside the aircraft. I was exposed to the cold night air. Then my vision came back, and there beside me, careering towards the earth, was my blazing aircraft. So that's Reg's account, Paul, which so that when writing the book, so that's Reg said that to me, and I've got video of him saying that to me, and it's just it's almost poetic, the way he talks about this bliss. This I felt so at peace, extraordinary, and it's something I can only say anecdotally. I don't know if this general goes, but I've come across this a few times. A sort of an air crew's resignation to go down with the aircraft. So Calton Younger, whose book I published, No Flight from the Cage, when they were going down, his pilot said to him, "Jump, Cal," and Cal said it crossed his mind to stay in the aircraft with his pilot, to not jump. And there's another interview I did with Steve Masters, who was a 7 Squadron navigator, and they were shot down just after D-Day, on a raid just after D-Day to a rail yards. And he said, when we were being shot, I felt like perhaps I should just go into the nose of the aircraft to make it quick and get it out of the way. I died quickly. This whether this is a general experience, I don't know. I'm pulling out some anecdotes here. But this almost resignation, well, this is it, I've had it, but just make it quick, please.
I mean, I can definitely see, Stephen, you've interviewed way more RAF and other nation flyers than I have, is that as a flyer, you're already to a certain extent defying physics. You're somewhere where human beings shouldn't be. I think my friend Greg Way, who writes about the Felsenberger, who was a submariner, would say, if you're a submariner, you're accepting you're going into an environment humans are not naturally meant to be in, and the same has been the year. So maybe that gives flyers and submariners and people like that a bit more of a fatalistic attitude to life, a sort of a sense of we're already kind of defying the laws of physics. So maybe there's an acceptance that you're into an arena where your life can be snapped away. Maybe something about that environment. Does that make any sense to you?
It does. It certainly does make sense to me. It resonates with what I've heard from people. Maybe we need to get a psychiatrist involved. Maybe they will know more. So someone who's been a combat psychiatrist to understand how people do. I mean, coping mechanisms is very interesting.
Yeah,
I think with aircrew, if they, how do they cope with all the pressures? Well, the drinking maybe and the socializing and that coming up with the language. If they lose a friend, so and so bought it. They get a language together that maybe helps them cope. And maybe this is just the way of coping with imminent death. I hope I'm never put in that situation. But it's certainly anecdotes that I've heard more than once.
Yeah, no, it is fascinating, and I wonder again where there's a difference between pilots and co-pilots and crew, in that if you're a pilot, you are to some extent in control of the environment. I mean, although if the controls get hit, you lose control quickly. But if you're an air gunner or a radio operator or something, you have absolutely no control in the situation you're in, and so you've already been trained to be dependent on someone else doing their job well, and you're in their hands entirely, and in a fragile airframe entirely. So I can see that an air gunner, radio operator, you just kind of assume that's what's going to happen is what's going to happen. It's none of it's I'll just do my job, but I can't control what's going to happen to us.
Yeah, and the pilot took definitely I've experienced the pilot took responsibility for his crew. I think it's probably I was going to mention it a bit later, but I'll mention it now. Reg, till the day he died, struggled with the fact that he survived and 2 of his crew were killed in the operation. Now, going by his account of what happened that night, he had nothing he could do about that situation, but nevertheless, it definitely played on Reg's mind. They did take responsibility. I mentioned Steve Masters there. So Steve's pilot was an Australian called Alan Grant, and the last sight that they had of Alan when their Lancaster was going down, just before they bailed out, Alan wasn't a particularly tall man. He had his feet up, holding on the dashboard, holding the control column like this, while his mates got out and Alan went down with the aircraft. How many Victoria Crosses could Bomber Command have won if we knew all the stories that happened in those aircraft with those guys? So yes, so right. Should we jump to the next extract then? From the book, just after Reg has just been shot down. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. My instinct was to get to Denmark because that was where I could find help. I set off, and when I got to the edge of the wood, I had to think of what to do next. I knew the direction I wanted to go and began crawling along a ditch. I suddenly became aware of voices, and then people approaching me. They must have seen me silhouetted against the fires. The trees were on fire, not just the aeroplane. Someone said in German something like, "Come with me." It sounded friendly enough. I became surrounded. There weren't any middle-aged men. They were either very old or very young. They all grabbed part of my battle dress. The children were holding onto my trousers, all clinging terribly tightly to this British RAF Terrorflieger, as they called me. To my mind, how could I be a Terrorflieger? I was here to liberate them, to liberate Europe from the Nazis. Things are very much black and white when you're young and in that situation. All these people were so excited. They'd heard my aircraft screaming down over their village, doing hundreds and hundreds of miles an hour. It must have made a tremendous din. They must have been terrified out of their lives. And then they captured the Terrorflieger. So what were they to do with him? A teenager held a revolver of some kind, a small pistol which he had up to my head. His hand was shaking. And there I was, completely consumed with calmness. I felt sorry for these people, really. It was an extraordinary situation. After a little while, they handed me over to 2 men in uniform. I had to accompany them with hands on my head, and they gave me the odd kick, but nothing more. So there's a contrast between Reg's experience in August of 1944, bomber offensive, and going on a number of years, compared to David's experience, where he was given cognac. in the officers.
I mean, that is really interesting, isn't it, Steve? Because if you were to chart on one graph the danger of flying into Germany, it would more or less be getting easier and easier. I mean, people would argue, no, there were still some very difficult raids, but certainly by 1945, the odds were more in your favor than they'd been earlier in the war. But the experiences on the ground, the graph goes the other way, doesn't it? You know, your chances of surviving and being treated well in 40, 41, and as you say there, as the notion of the terror flyers and the Yabos and the Germans are on the receiving end of what Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force, etc., are doing, your chance of getting away from it were increased. Now, Holly yesterday gave the staggering statistic that I think over 1,000 American POWs were killed in early 45 by Allied bombing, you know, being in camps and being moved on marches, you know. So not only a hostile welcome on the ground, your own force that you've been flying with is now a danger to you on the ground. So, yeah, the experiences and chances as the war went on for being shot down changed variably a lot.
Absolutely. So all 44, the attrition of the bomber commands, attrition of the Battle of the Ruhr and the Battle of Berlin, and the Nuremberg raid, you know, that's happened, and Bomber Command is now coming into even being venturing out on daylight raids. So the chances of being shot down, well, there were still some raids, there were significant losses. Chances of being shot down were diminishing, but the reception you got on the ground had changed markedly. I mean, we did it. I think it was a couple of years ago, Paul, wasn't it? We did a bit about my book, Flight Path to Murder, where we
link in the description below, folks. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and that's when we talk about Terrorfliegers and the murder of Allied aircrew. So certainly, it was hostile, and you hopefully, although what I hear from veteran aircrew is that if they were shot down, hopefully they came into the hands of the Luftwaffe, as opposed to any other branches. So jump now to another aspect, if I can, because I'm very, very keen with the books that I'm doing is to get the family side of what's going on as well, because, you know, Reg is being shot down, and he's one of 7, and they've got next of kin, and it's quite interesting because we haven't mentioned my grandfather was a Lancaster pilot, and he was shot down in May 44, and it was his father who wrote to all the crew, all the families of the crew, and he got them all talking about what was going on. And John Barker, Reg's father, does exactly the same, writing to everybody. So I've got just a short, I'll read not all of it, just a short correspondence between John Barker, who wrote to a Mr. Kinsey, so Bill Kinsey was one of Reg's crew. So if I'll read from the book again. Just so when John Barker wrote to Mr. Kinsey, Bill Kinsey's father, in October, he had heard that Reg was also safe. On the 11th of October, Mr. Kinsey replied, and I quote, "I was very glad to have your letter today and to know that you've heard that the skipper is safe. I've no information this way since the notification. I hope and trust the Germans' news is true. Somehow I have a feeling that the crew are all safe. Just a hunch, that's all. On the night of August 26, 27, I was downstairs, as is my custom, until about 2 a.m. At 1:30, I felt that Bill was in trouble. And although I'd naturally have been relieved, I would have been surprised if the telegraph boy didn't appear on Monday morning. Worse luck, he did. But after the first awful moments, I felt, as I've said, as Bill had done in the neighbourhood of 60 ops over Germany, his luck was very good. Now we are left with the hope that our lads will one day cross the threshold again. Should I hear anything definite, I'll lose no time in writing to you." So there's the hope. So we have the hope. They've all got this hope at the moment. They've had the telegram. They've had the letter from the squadron CO probably as well. Now they're just waiting and hope to get the news that comes through. So on 5th of December 1944, Mr. Kinsey wrote to John Barker again. "I've heard from the Air Ministry. They say 5 of the crew are POWs in Germany and 2 lost their lives. Flying Officer Dobson, it was actually Boston, he'd spelt the name wrong in the letter, but we'll stick with what he's got in the letter. Flying Officer Dobson and one unidentified as yet. That was Bill, my son. It'll be a miracle if such is not the case. I must not complain. Thousands have had to sacrifice so that future generations may live in freedom. One thing comforts me above all else on this earth, Bill, or Taffy as the RAF knew him, was in the job he wanted from childhood. That is the fortune of war. I had a family, wife, 2 sons and 1 daughter in September 1941. And except for my son John, who's in the States, I'm all alone. But I have very happy memories that always remain. I must say my son's luck was phenomenal. He'd done around 60 ops. Well, Mr. Barker, I'm glad you know your son is safe. Perhaps at some future date I may be able to hear or read some details of their last op on the 26th, 27th of August. I sometimes think Dobson and Bill were either killed or wounded by flak and were unable to bail out. Let us all earnestly hope and pray that this awful business will soon end, and that the war will definitely ensure peace for a long time to come.
Wow.
And then John Barker replied to the letter to Mr. Kinsey. Many times since receiving your letter, I've tried to write to you, but the words would just not come to me. Your news was a great shock to me, for I'd hoped and prayed for something better. Then I awaited a letter from my son, hoping it would give me some help, but it brought no information about that unfortunate flight. I felt I'd known Taffy so well, although we'd never met, for I'd followed the forming of the crew and their subsequent progress with great interest. It certainly does you great credit in the way you try to console yourself, and I admire your spirit, yet know that inwardly you must feel that deep, irreplaceable loss. This, after your other losses, must have been a bitter blow, and my heart and understanding go out to you. It is with this understanding that I realise how futile it is to try and express one's feelings on paper. Perhaps someday we shall have the pleasure of talking things over with more facts before us than we have at present. I've tried my best to express myself, yet it seems but a very poor effort. But I trust that this will at least dispel any bad thoughts you may have had by not hearing from me earlier. So yes, so that's an example of some of the correspondence. I think that's what a difficult letter that John Barker had to write there, and I think it's like he's taking on, it's almost like his son's role.
Yeah.
To speak to the family, and
I was just going to say that it's like from those letters, the crew that's been broken up has been replaced by a new crew of the parents becoming what their sons had been, to carry on that teamwork and the fact they felt they know each other. And I was going to, well, thank you for reading those accounts. I was also, when people are saying they're tearing up listening to you read them, but I also want to pay you a compliment and say, in many ways, you're not an aviation historian. You're a people historian who happen to be in aviation. And I think there's lots of YouTube channels and books that are obsessed about the rivet counts, about the Mark III changed the Mark IV, and the cockpit did this, and the sliding door under that changed, and they built the new thing in there that did that. And people get into these endless discussions about whether this variant of bomber was better in this type of variant of bomber. At the heart of it, it's about families dealing with the loss, and especially with the missing in action, the unknowing, the uncertainty, and the collateral damage of a family being broken up. It's not just the aircraft being lost or the people on the aircraft. It's the members of the family who don't now have a brother coming back, or a husband coming back, or a son coming back. And so well done for what you do, Steve. Yes, you're a people historian who just happen to be aviators, a lot of them.
Well, thank you for that. It was interesting when we were doing the Lancaster documentary. We talked about the treatment for the documentary, and it's very much that the Lancaster is the canvas upon which we paint the human stories. That's the sort of metaphor that you could use. Yeah. And the families I had, if I can just, we're okay for time, Paul. I had a meeting which moved me very much, actually. A chap in St Albans, and his brother was an air gunner, and he was killed in Bomber Command. We were writing an article for the Fail to Return series we did. And it was around about VE Day that I'd gone to speak to him and whatever. And he hates the VE Day celebrations. He told me the last time he saw his brother, he chucked his sack over his back and walked out the door. And then at the end of the war, everybody's celebrating and they were having parties. And he said, but my brother wasn't coming back. What are you all celebrating for? And he hated the anniversary of VE Day ever since, because it reminded him that his brother wasn't coming back. You know, so there's that side. So it's I hadn't really thought about before.
It's going off a rabbit hole, but I remember talking to Alex Kershaw, who's a mate of mine living in the States, about the Bedford Boys and how that small town in Virginia that lost 19 people of its townie, how that if family A living in house in the street, their son is coming back, but family B, who are neighbors, whose son isn't coming back, can family A have a welcome home party for their son, right, when the neighbors next door can't have the party? Do you go and have the party somewhere else? Do you hire a village hall and do it somewhere else? But then that means, are you then excluding the neighbor? Maybe the neighbors do want to be. It's very, very complicated. So I think the best bit of Alex's book is about what happens to that town. And parents don't know how to start conversations with the parents whose son is or isn't coming back. Do you do a cheery hello to someone? Do you cross the street to avoid having a conversation? These are the conversations about loss. The people who are obsessed about which tank is coolest don't have these conversations. And I wish they did. I wish they went into this human drama that war brings. And I pride myself at this channel that we never lose sight of the fact this is a conflict in which millions died, and the collateral effect of that is enormous.
Yeah, I mean, the grief. I've got two boys in their 20s. I don't know how I would cope if something happened to them. I try not to go down the rabbit hole, but it's like the Bomber Command Memorial. How important that was. Viktor Frankl, who wrote the book Meaning of Life's Meaning, and he was referring to experiences in concentration camps and how people survive. And he said, as long as there was meaning to the suffering, people could deal with it. And there's almost like an equation. Despair was suffering without the meaning. And that's why things like the Bomber Command Memorial are so important, because they give meaning to the suffering. So the families that are in despair, this is, maybe I'm being a bit too hopeful here, a bit too optimistic, but they've got something that they can hang on to, that all that suffering that took place, there is now meaning. What you're doing is giving meaning to what these sacrifices actually were. I've got to put to the end of Reg, because Reg struggled with the loss of two of his crew forever. So and he's got a poem at the end of his chapter, which I'll just read the introduction that I gave it, and then I'll read the actual poem, if that's okay.
Please do.
Yeah. So this is me. So Reg and Joan had two children. So he got married, Claire and Sylvia, 4 grandchildren. At time of writing, 6 great-grandchildren, with 1 on the way. At the time of putting this book together, Reg was nearing his 96th birthday. It's been a pleasure to spend time with him over recent years and be able to go through his archive. I hope through this story the reader has been able to get a feel for Reg's nature, a wonderful man with an infectious bonhomie and air of goodwill. However, I do get the distinct impression that Reg still battles demons in regard to what happened all those years ago on the night of 27th of August 1944. He will remember the friends he lost, but his optimism of life shines through. In the exercise book that Reg had with him while in a captivity is the following unassigned poem, which was written on the wall of a solitary confinement cell in Dulaglift, Frankfurt, Germany. It's easy to be nice, boys, when everything's okay. It's easy to be cheerful when you're having things your way. But can you hold your head up and take it on the chin when your heart is nearly breaking and you feel like giving in? It was easy back in England, amongst your friends and folks, but now you'll miss the friendly hand, the joy, the songs and jokes. The road ahead is stony, and unless you're strong in mind, you'll find it isn't long before you're lagging far behind. You've got to climb that hill, boys. It's no use turning back. There's only one way home, and that's off the beaten track. Remember that you're British, and that when you reach the crest, you'll see a valley cool and green, England at her best. You know, there is a saying that sunshine follows rain, and sure enough you'll realise that joy will follow pain. Let courage be your password and fortitude your guide, and then instead of grousing, just remember those who died. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, quite a poignant, optimistic, telling that this, written in a solitary confinement cell in Dulaglift, so that's where aircrew would come before they're moving on, being moved on to the main camps. Here's someone putting something up, maybe, saying to those who are going to come in his wake, keep climbing that hill, boys, and remember the boys who didn't make it out. And I think that that ends Reg's chapter. That just remember those who died, and Reg did.
Because
so, yeah.
And thanks for reading that. Because how to deal mentally with this experience, how to deal with being a POW, the trauma of being shot down, the improvement in evasion techniques, the improvement in escape gear, you can see it there. You can see it in the MI9 initiatives, etc., etc. Crews were much better prepared by 44 than they had been in 40, 41. But I can't think anybody is mentally better prepared for it later. No one's going to sit these guys and say, you might have no hope. How do you deal with suicidal feelings? I mean, no one's going to sit down. There's going to be that British, but by extension across the nationalities, this sense of stiff upper lip. Let's not talk about that. But that poem is clearly someone trying to help someone else. Maybe that person has been through a dark period themselves and someone gave them a bit of advice or a pat on the back or something, and they're feeling the need to leave that in that solitary confinement cell to give someone else, when they're at their lowest ebb, a little bit of a hope. And that's, as we kind of gradually bring things to a close, with the dealing you have done, lots of veterans, would you be able to summarize the POW experiences, or is it too varied from man to man?
I think it is varied. It is varied. It's certainly not escape is a game, that sort of cliche that we've got out there. You get in escape. I mean, I think the greatest prisoner of war memoir was written by Carlton Younger, who wrote No Flight from the Cage, which he allowed me to republish for him. And there's a lot of boredom that they have to tolerate and that they have to put up with. And blokes, there's not a camaraderie. They get fed up with each other, and all their little habits are really annoying.
Yeah.
All this this sort of thing going on. But I know also that Cal, and I think he did feel it hurt him that he wasn't able to do his job, that he had been shot down. I think they were on something like their 6th operation. But I'm now. I've never been a prisoner, so I'm outside of this, and there's a camaraderie and an understanding of the experience you went through. Because not only we haven't gone on and talked about the long march and that experience and the hunger of being involved in the long, and as you mentioned earlier about being shot up by friendly aircraft, for example. There's further horrors to come for these.
Well, if you want to talk about the march, you're welcome to.
Well, yes. So that all of these guys will have done that. So that evacuation, as the Russians are advancing, they've got to evacuate the camps quickly and head west to get away from the advancing Russians. And the Germans are in a pretty poor state as it is at that time. Anyway, and so they're tramping along the road. When they left Stalag 3, they had sledges, and then that thawed. So a lot of detritus is just left along the side. And the constant hunt for food and the desire to get food. Similarly, amongst the German guards, it's not a pleasant experience as well. And then when one column was being shot up by typhoons, and I think on that particular incident, 50 lads were killed, having come through what they've come through, and then ending up with that experience. So it's very. I've spoken to some Gulf War prisoners of war as well, friends with a couple of the Gulf War POWs, and they always tell me the story that there's the RAF Prisoner of War Association, and I think there were the 6 of the Gulf War POWs. They didn't know. They first went to the ex-POW Association, and they didn't know what to expect, and they felt very uncertain about it. And then when they arrived there, the Second World War veterans embraced them and took them in and made them part of the community, because they had a common understanding of what the loss of freedom actually meant. And we can read about what the loss of freedom was, but we can't feel what the loss of freedom was. We can't feel that within ourselves. So they can empathise and can deal with that.
No, yeah, definitely. And with the idea of warfare, I mean, it is an ongoing issue that serving veterans, retiring, don't feel that same connection with perhaps the organisations like the British Legion or than the World War II vets. That feel the wars feel different, and the tech is very different, and the motivation behind wars and the way wars are waged. Although Ukraine has gone a bit like the old wars, but the experience of being incarcerated doesn't change, does it? You know, whether you're a prisoner, whether you're a Crusader knight, a prisoner, 1,000 years ago, or a guy who's been taken to Afghanistan. If you're locked up in a small room with limited food, that experience is the same. And you have not knowing when it's going to come to an end.
And you have to be very careful when you're going in and speaking to people about this experience, because you are bringing back, and it's any bomber command guys, you have to be very, very wary. We've all heard that veterans don't speak to their families about what they did. We know that, and you've got to be very wary. You're taking back to a place they don't necessarily want to go. And I would say that's more of a case with the prisoners of war, that they don't necessarily want to go back to hunger. They don't want to necessarily go back to someone having a revolver up against their head. They don't want to go back about being in a blazing inferno and seeing one of their mates not getting out. So we have a responsibility that we have to be very careful that we're taking people back to those scenarios and those feelings.
Well, when I was a young budding historian with hair, I joined a couple of associations of veterans as an associate member in the Essex area. I joined the Parachute Regiment Association as associate and mentored meetings in Chelmsford. Met these guys, talking about Arnhem, and it was lots of drinking and lots of talking of stories about knocking out Tiger tanks, and it was carousing out of it. I also joined the POW Association, Far Eastern Prisoners of War, and went to some of their meetings, and that was a very different experience. It was basically like group therapy of little old guys just telling horrific stories of the treatment of this. And did you see what happened to those Burmese ladies there? Let me tell you what happened to the Chinese over there. Let me tell. And lots of hugging and lots of tears. It's almost like those clips you see of people sitting in circles in chairs. You know, hello, I'm new to the film. Let me tell you my story. An admission of what they'd been through and what they'd witnessed. And I have to say, as a young man, I was interested in football and girls and music. I went to about 3 or 4 of these, and I used to come back feeling absolutely wretched for about a week afterwards. And I would stay in my bedroom and listen to even more gloomy 80s kind of dark albums by Echo and the Bunnymen and the Smiths, and thinking, what the hell is it all about? And I stopped going because they were just bleak times. And that's my only experience. I mean, that's mostly infantry and people captured in Singapore, but oh god, those memories haunt me to this day of the stuff I heard, and I felt I was just privy to counseling, unofficial counseling of little old men telling these horrific stories. But we've got a couple of questions from viewers, if you don't mind. I mean, you may have a few things you want to say, but this is from Ian Carr. It's about Reg. And he said, did Reg clearly differentiate in his memory between lost members in his own crew and other missing members of the squadron? So I think what we're saying there is the loss of someone in your own aircraft where you have some feeling of responsibility towards it, but other people who you knew in different aircraft, was there a difference the way he looked at and processed that?
I can't recall specifically for Reg, but I can give a generalization answer on that one from other experiences, that crews were very, very careful not to make friends with other crews.
Right.
Because if you did make friends with other crews, you're exposing yourself to emotional problems when they didn't come back and the beds were empty to you. There would be a connection between flight engineers in one crew and a flight engineer in another crew, because they would often get together to navigators for planning for raids or whatever. But crews seemed to be quite reluctant. This is a generalization. To get a close bond with other crews, because you didn't know how long they were going to be there. So within the crew, strong bond. That's there. That's there are exceptions, but there's generally that squadron. Fighter squadron, there's the squadron bond, each of the individuals squadron together. Bomber squadron, the crew is the unit, if you like. So I don't recall Reg necessarily getting that upset about other people being lost. And the thing with Bomber Command, as I say, they had their coping mechanism. So and so bought it, so and so, and it was expected that losses would happen. And you're not seeing them being lost. You're not seeing them going down at night. And so there is a degree of separation. That does change around D-Day. There's more daylight raids, and you're seeing aircraft being hit by falling bombs from above, for example, next to you. You're seeing that loss. Interesting if there's a contrast between Bomber Command and 8th Air Force and their daylight raids. Perhaps there is. But no, don't make friends with other crews. because you don't know how long they're going to be there, and don't get an emotional attachment with the other crews.
Well, but as Gwilym just said there in the chat is, what about the fact that crews get mixed up every now and then? You know, a crew needs a navigator or an extra air gunner for a mission, and you're joining other crew. How, in your experience dealing with all sorts of veterans, how did an individual joining a foreign crew for a mission, how did you go about it? Did you just kind of just think about it as, consider it different? Is there any kind of rule of thumb you can explain there about how that worked?
Well, you'd have spare bods who come in and go into other crews. So your navigator might have a cold and not be able to fly. Maybe somebody could come in, but you're starting to get into lucky charms and luck. And if we've got someone who hasn't been with us before, it's going to be bad luck and that sort of thing. But generally, the crews did stick together. Generally, and there would be spare bods coming in and out all the time. And I wish I'd have had this question before, because there was one chap who talked a lot about it in a previous bit. I might need to come back on that one, but he was killed in his Lancaster crashed, and his turret broke off, and he went across a field, and he then became a spare bod going around crews, and I think he did cover that. Jerry Norwood, that's right, Jerry. But I'm afraid I can't bring it to mind at the moment how he described
bring you back
being
in
a spare
the
bod.
future.
Yeah.
Okay. But so to kind of round things off, you know, we talked with Holly yesterday, we talked with Tony and Dave on the first show, and we've got two more Steves coming. Everyone's been crossed apart from a couple. Anyway, a lot of people watching, well, not watching World War II TV, because we've got a learned bunch of people who actually read books watching us, but your wider world, the POW experience is defined by The Great Escape, by the Colditz, by Steve McQueen and his motorbike, that kind of thing, tunnels, trousers of dirt down your trousers, all that kind of stuff there. How much of that is a hindrance to our real understanding of the POW experience, in that hundreds of thousands of people didn't get involved in escaping, and were just miserable, and NCOs and enlisted men being worked brutally and lacking of food? Are we burdened by the movies and what our expectations of the POW experience is?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Blunt answer.
I think. I think we are. I do value the film, The Great Escape, and I've been out to Sargon a few times. But it's that romanticizing. You know, we talked earlier in this about me being involved in theatre, and you're moving something into, need to entertain an audience, or maybe the film The Great Escape perhaps went a bit too far, because what happened to those 50, the way they were killed, was awful and dreadful. You know, just took in pairs or whatever, taken into some woods and shot, and yet. You watch The Great Escape, there's almost a sense of optimism and a feeling of romantic success at the end of it. But I know other authors have certainly been challenging.
Guy Walters is absolutely of the opinion that The Great Escape was a waste of effort. It didn't drain. It put a drain on the German military war machine. The Germans swept up those POWs in a matter of hours, pretty much, and that everything Roger Bushell wanted to achieve didn't really happen. That it was. You know, he's very vocal about that. That's one of his ready to go, oven ready podcasts. Yes. I think he's just appeared on History Rage, telling that very story there. And yeah, you're right. There's nothing romantic about being taken into a field for a piss and then being shot in the back of the head while you're handcuffed. There's nothing at all idealistic about that. Again, we've got one more question from Pat. Sorry.
Just very quickly on that. So, I mean, David Fraser was shot down in May 41. He was a serial escaper. He tried lots of escapes. Now, he'd been a prisoner of war for 4 years. Maybe that's how he maintained his sanity. But the other guys, there was not I did not come across an appetite to be involved in escape. But we're talking now about 44, 45. There is the impression that the war is going to come to an end. So.
Yeah, and again, you've done your job. You know, you've been flying your mission. You've been in danger. You know, why risk it? Why risk it? And the warnings were clear. The Germans were saying the warnings: no escapers will be shot. You know, the commando order, etc., etc. So, a question from Pat over in Northern Ireland: when they got to POW camps, why didn't the NCOs stick together? Because we don't always crews they didn't necessarily stick as crews in prisoner of war camps. The prisoner of war camp structure seemed to be entirely different. Have you any explanation, kind of how that that worked and why it worked a different way, and it didn't kind of work on squadron basis or regimental basis? How did that work?
No, I'm not sure I can actually answer that question. The only My grandfather, he ended up in Bavaria compound at Stalager 3, which was officers, and his mid upper gunner didn't. I think he was in East compound, so there was certainly that. They were separated, but I'm afraid I can't answer that in respect of a policy of why that happened.
Well, I mean, Holly said yesterday about the Americans in her research that the camp her great grandfather Warren was in is that there was a kind of a democracy working, and no decision was made by the camp or by a Hartonist. It got 85% vote among the prisoners, and it wasn't based on rank. It was based on, I forget whether it was the Hart or the camp, and again, I think your mindset is going to change when you are now a prisoner of war. You are still wearing the uniform of an air gunner if you've still got a uniform, if you've still had it through the process of being captured, or you're a sergeant in the, whatever you are, the Royal Fusiliers. But you're now not that anymore. You are a cog in a mechanism where you've got a number and you've got to go and queue up for your food or whatever it would be there. So I think maybe trying to pretend that it's all still like it was back at home in Blighty and that it's still a regimental system and there's a sergeant major probably wasn't the right way to cope with it. Start a new system and treat it. I don't know.
No. Yeah.
But we will bring things to an end because it's been a great conversation with you, Steve. So before we end things up, what's next on the writing front? What's next on the Steve Darlow desk?
Well, I'm hopefully going to put Sean Feast, who's a great author. He's written a book about a Mosquito master bomber with a daughter of the master bomber. So hopefully I'm going to look to get that published. We'll do that, and then we're going to crack on with the Mosquito documentary. The Copenhagen raid is going to feature in it, and I think we're going to hopefully get out to Copenhagen and interview 3 of the women who I don't know if you're familiar with that, Paul, but the school was hit.
Oh yeah, the film that came out on Netflix last year.
So we've managed to locate 3 of the girls who were at the school.
Wow.
So we want to get out there and interview them. But we need to raise money. It's making films.
As always, making films, writing history. There's no money in it, folks, unless you're in the top little elite thing. I get these emails saying, surely you live in a castle now you're doing World War II. And I go, no, I'm in debt up to my eyeballs. There's no money in this. But I mean, we do it because we love it, don't we? But yeah, no, I can't wait to have you back on or have Sean back on about that. So, links to your website is in the description below. You have your own YouTube channel. You're always putting information on website and social media so people can find out what you're up to and find out your books. The best way to get your books is directly from your publishing, isn't it, I guess?
Yeah, fightinghigh.com. We'll have signed copies. And elsewhere as well. And hopefully I'll do a few air shows as well this year if people are at the air shows.
Brilliant stuff.
With George Dunn, who's fantastic, 100-year-old veteran, so hopefully he'll be with us at a couple of air shows.
Brilliant. So, folks, we're back in tomorrow with Steve, another Steve, and then Friday with another Steve. So we've got a show about Americans shot down over Paris tomorrow. Then we've got another show on Friday about another experience of a B-17 crew. So it's all shot down. The theme continues. If you're new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe. There's a couple of new people been joining us this week following my appearance of Indian Spartacus on Time Ghost. So welcome to the channel. All the information you need is in the description, and consider becoming a member or patron. And as always, buy my guests' books. They come on these channels out the goodness of their heart. A few more sales will help keep the tax man happy and the bailiff away, because anyone who thinks military historians they've lost the Kriegies, there it is. Go and get it, because it's a great read, as are all of your books. So Steve, thank you very much for joining us. Folks, thank you very much for your insightful questions. I will see you all again tomorrow. This is Paul Wedding for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers, everybody. Bye.